in the interest of full disclosure, it's a great pleasure to be sitting at the table with Mr. Liepman. He and I have known each other for almost a quarter century, so it's having him refer to me as Mr. Mudd is going to be the source of great amusement later today, and I much appreciate that. I don't really have an oral statement, but I wanted, Senator Collins talked about people telling stories. I wanted to tell a story of how this looks to someone who in the past has looked at terrorism overseas and for the past 3.5 years has been posted at the Bureau, kind of to tell you the story of a complicated picture, and if I succeed, make it coherent in 9 minutes and 23 seconds, so I'll give it a try. Think of this as an example of globalization. You know, if you wake up in the morning and want to know what's happening in the stock market, you look at the DAX in Germany, you look at what's happening in the European and Asian exchanges. This is an example of globalization on a different front. Talk about a couple of intersecting trends. The first, Andy talked about 1991, the fall of the Siad Barre regime, government, the rise of warlordism in the 90s, the rise of the Islamic courts in the 90s and into this century. So the first trend, if you will, is ungoverned space, as people refer, a place where somebody like al-Shabaab can develop training camps, a place that looks something like the tribal areas of Pakistan, for example, or the Sahel, Mali, Chad, southern Algeria. So that's your first piece. Places around the world that lack governance happen to correspond with places where we have problems. Yemen would be another example. The second trend I would point to, and that is, if you look at Bosnia or Kashmir or Afghanistan from the 80s after the Soviet invasion, you have magnets of activity for Islamic extremists. Now, Somalia is a bit different. For example, Somali Americans and Somalis in general did not flock to jihads elsewhere, but nonetheless, Shabaab has linkages to this global Islamist movement. Its leadership has linkages to al-Qaeda leadership. So I think the second trend I'd point out to, again in the context of globalization, is this is another example, after examples in places like Bosnia or Chechnya, of an Islamist activity serving as a magnet for international jihadists. I point out that not only are Americans showing up, we've got Western Europeans, Brits. We had a Brit blow himself up recently in Somalia. We've got Nigerians, Chadians, Malians. And the third, and perhaps the most significant, and I want to emphasize this because I think some will say, well, this is just another example of global jihad, is the nationalist aspect of this. We saw a change in the American community in 2006 when the Ethiopians invaded, and part of the draw for people in this country is to go fight for their country against a foreign invader. So global issues in the Horn of Africa having an immediate impact, a ripple effect on communities in Columbus, Ohio, in Cincinnati, in Seattle, and San Diego, and Minnesota. It's a real example of what globalization means in the new information world. And I use the phrase information world advisedly. You have direct connectivity between Somalia and the United States. It doesn't have to be by the internet. It can be by Skype or email, friends talking to each other. And this is a very tight community where that kind of information is getting around independent of any internet websites. Let me overlay some more micro issues onto that sort of macro witch's brew of these trends of ungoverned space and an Islamist magnet, nationalism. You've got a community that comes here in contrast to some other immigrant stories, for example, of Indian communities or Pakistani communities with doctors and engineers. These are folks who come here because they're escaping great trauma in their home country. They're working here in meatpacking plants, poultry processing plants, often not a great command in the first generation of the English language among their parents. If you look at many of the people we're talking about, they're coming from single-family homes, and particular homes that are led by sisters or grandmothers or mothers where there's not a father figure. They're echoes of what we see overseas. Again, I want to emphasize that we are not alone in looking at this isolated problem. I want to sign up to what Andy said. This is not a community problem. In a sense, we don't have radicalized communities. We do have radicalized clusters of people, typically used between, let's say, 17 and above, although we've seen efforts to radicalize kids as young as 12, 13, 14 years old in this country. Like what you would see in Europe, it's not necessarily a Shabaab person in Somalia radicalizing a youth in the United States. These are issues within the community where people from these kinds of families might see an older brother or father figure who starts to sort of spot assess and recruit, as we say in the spy business, someone who might be vulnerable, and eventually sets them on a path to take a plane ticket to Somalia or Ethiopia or someplace else that's an avenue to get into Somalia. This is important because this is the kind of thing you might see in Western Europe or Britain. And in fact, in talking to my friends in even the Arabian Peninsula, we may think that we are much different from a place like Saudi Arabia, but you see that kind of cluster recruitment by friends or older brother figures or community figures elsewhere around the world.